So let's start with talking about Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey. So what we see out there is a great drama, a great drama of the gods and a great drama of humans being played out together, intertwined, and the actions of the gods affecting the actions of the humans, and the actions of the humans affecting sort of, the lives of everybody around. And from that, what can we derive, what can we understand in general about the place of the divine in ancient Greece? And this is just one interpretation, of course, that I'm forwarding out here, and I'll share a lot of texts on Classroom that you can have a look at to get sort of a more varied view of this. But religion, in some ways, we could think of, the two poems as well. One way of thinking about it, and one of the interpretations, is that it sort of is a culmination of a series of folk beliefs, and folk beliefs about gods and humans and their interaction and the place of gods and which gods which god you should pray to for what, and what the place of temples is, what the place of shrines is, and ritual. The most important part here, ritual. The rituals that were involved in everyday life. Which, in fact, what is the place of ritual as well? Why do we have ritual? Ritual are these material actions that help people in some ways to connect to the sort of immediate world around them. It's a kind of chthonic connection to the world. Anyway, I'm not going to go too much into the aspect of the ritual and ritualistic element of religion, but there were certain folk beliefs which then, in some ways, get solidified in this, or rather systematized in some way in a narrative. A narrative systematization, which is different, you will see, from philosophic systematization. In a narrative, in a poem, and that's what both Iliad and Odyssey are. They are these long epic poems that work as a systematization of myth, that systematize myth, and it's more or less systematic in the sense that there is a story, a narrative. Okay, this happened, so why was there a war in Troy? Because in this sort of version of the story, you have a battle between these three goddesses, which then spilled over onto the human realm, because also the human realm was involved from the very beginning. And perhaps, it is also because of some kind of a, eugenic clearing that Zeus is doing. So what kind of attributes are attributes attributed to these gods, and what sort of reasons for action are given to these gods are sort of what are systematized in this narrative. Now, what are gods? How are gods different? I mean, if you think about it, it's not that gods are some kind of a higher moral creature. If you think about Zeus and Hera and Mercury, or rather Hermes. And if you think of all the sort of gods and goddesses and their actions, by our modern standard, they don't seem to be very ethical or moral or right or just, but yet they are considered to be sort of the holders of decay, of justice, right? Now what differentiates, let's say, gods from humans? So one thing, like if we look for the lowest common factor of all the gods, the lowest common factor is that they are divine. And what does divine even mean? We're not going into etymology, which has to do with light and things, but the idea of they are athanatos, undying, right? They can't die, and so the gods are a special form of being, let's say, who are both alive and undying, right? They are not mortal. They are not thnetos. They are not brotos. They're not the people who would, bleed and die and pass away. So the idea, the thing that characterizes these gods are that they are immortal. These immortal gods, however, still have a system of rank and file. They have an order. They have so they have a kind of hierarchy amongst the gods. And what is the point of these hierarchies? So the use in some ways of these hierarchies is that it in some ways it reflects the hierarchies that you would find in human society as well. So as high above the common person, the lords, the human lords are, the kings and the aristocrats are, that much higher up the gods are, right? And there's this idea of like hierarchy. So there's a hierarchy of like the gods, and then the sort of powerful humans, and then the common humans, and this sort of a hierarchical system then recreates the hierarchical systems of Earth. So in some ways, if you think about it, it's not precisely a cosmogonical or cosmological desire to find sort of answers to natural questions, which are the only thing that are reflected, or in fact they're not even very clearly reflected in the idea of the gods and the narratives of the gods and the myths of the gods, but more of a kind of political order that is sort of that is recreated. So even amongst the gods, then you have a king. It's not a sort of communist utopia amongst the gods, right? You have a king, and you have a rank and file, and the king is all powerful. So all the gods are powerful in their own ways, but the king is sort of more powerful than that, and the king also has. The right to caprice. So with power, what comes with power is caprice. So the gods can be extremely capricious. I mean, the whole Battle of Troy is a caprice of the gods. If you look at the narrative of the Iliad, is that the three goddesses, got into a fight at this wedding party. We're not going into the whole myth. You can read it up. So they got into a quarrel. That quarrel was badly resolved by a human who was, unfortunately chosen to do this. And why was he chosen? It was also it looks like some kind of a plan. So the Battle of Troy might have actually happened. In fact, I think they have found some kind of historical evidence, archaeological evidence, that there was some battle there in the region that is supposed to be Troy. But, what led to... The question is, the desire for explaining the reasons for the battle. I mean, you can imagine, a battle in which a whole city is destroyed, so many people are killed. It's something, that we cannot deal with that sort of, I mean, why did it happen? Why did it have to happen? That sort of a question. It's like, why have you done this? Who has done this? And so the way of explaining it could be that it was, I mean, you could have many different explanations for this, and people could come up with many different explanations for this. But in the Iliad and the Odyssey, the explanation that they have come up with is that it was a caprice of the gods. It was a fight or quarrel amongst the gods, and they had their favorites. Right. So in the Battle of Troy, you had, Aphrodite had her favorite, which was Paris. Then Hera had, people she hated. And then you had, which were the Trojans, that is, and then you had Athena. So you have this sort of a battle that is going on, and then there are these the tricks and plans that happen even amongst the gods. So the idea is that there is a reflection of the earthly in the divine, and the divine is used to explain then, in some kind of a twisted mirror image, the issues, the problems of earthly life, and to explain away in many ways, things that could have been felt to be very unjust. You feel it is unjust, but what do you mean by justice? Are you a god? Are you a lord? I remember I was reading in one of the books. I'll look it up and tell you which one. That in the same way as it is not for humans to question the motives of the gods and the actions of the gods. So, for example, when in the very beginning, when Achilles gets extremely angry with Agamemnon and he's about to go and kill him, and he can because he's in some ways bodily stronger. Athena, I think Athena comes up and stops him and says, "Don't do this." Right now. They are almost like he is talking to her, but he defers to her. Why does he defer to her? Because he says, well, you're a goddess, and I don't want to go against you. Also, he could get into a lot of trouble for going against a goddess, because even though he's like a demigod in some ways, half born from a goddess, he's mortal. As you know, he dies at the end of the Iliad, or rather in the beginning of the Odyssey. Anyway, he dies. And so the point is that he does not question Athena, and he says, okay, because you tell me and you're a goddess, I shall do this. It's not a question of how just, unjust. I'm extremely angry, but I will hold my anger because I'm told by a goddess. And a lot of actions are explained by the human actions. Gods tell them and they do it. But in the same way, but he can be angry at Agamemnon, equal in rank. But when a common soldier gets angry with Agamemnon and criticizes him, Odysseus tells him, "Who are you? You cannot do this." And he's made fun of, and he's told that if he does this again, he shall be very badly punished. So the idea of rank is always preserved. So now I know I have digressed a lot into the politics of ancient epic or of Iliad and Odyssey, but what is going on then is that if these gods are used to explain natural phenomena, so there is a huge thunderstorm and lightning and everything, and why does it happen? It's because Zeus was very angry at some behavior of the humans, which means that every time you have a natural phenomena, you need to find an explanation via narrative and story and myth for natural phenomena, which leads to an impossibility, really, of systematization. You have the problem is that you will always have to form new stories, new narratives, and there is a kind of explanation there, but it is not systematized. You cannot make predictions based on it. You cannot sort of predict, okay, what will happen next. Okay, in this case it happened because you can only sort of make narratives about the past in that sense. The future narratives are a bit more difficult to create because I can say, okay, the war of Troy happened because of the quarrel between the gods, but if I say it rained at that time, or there was an eclipse at that time because of a god's anger or a god's deception or something of that sort, then it's impossible for me to predict any future eclipses, and it's impossible for me to understand crop cycles and weather, and and which means that I do not have a cosmos. Right? I don't have order. It might be beautiful in the cosmos in the other sense. There is order. There's a cosmos of the ranks in that sense, but it's the order is. There is no natural order, right? So when we talk about the natural and the supernatural, there is something about the supernatural which escapes understanding. And in a way, myth comes back. Whenever, even in sort of philosophical thinking and scientific thinking, there are parts where we cannot explain everything. There are things that we have not been able to explain. So there are two ways of dealing with it, and often enough, you'll see in the history of science and the history of philosophy, these gaps are explained away by a kind of myth making. And if you want to think of it as this combination of religion, poetry, myth, so religion in some ways was, through these epic poems, was both systematized, and through that, and systematized in the other sense, both sort of narrativized, let's say, rather than systematized, and then became a kind of text, an oral text, even, but of practiced religion. So people would then refer to Homer, saying, "Oh well, as this one did this, as Achilles did this in that one, or as this was the task of Apollo, or this, I will pray to Apollo because Apollo does this, or I will pray to Poseidon because Poseidon does this." So poetry in some ways also prescribes. It didn't just sort of describe, let's say, religion. The Iliad and the Odyssey also prescribed religion. So there is a sort of combination. There's something going on out here. So to move from this, to a kind of theogony that we have in Hesiod, is to start asking. So the concern of a theogony is to ask about the world's ancestry, right? It's about what is the origin of the world. What is the creation? What is the genesis? The creation. It's a kind of a desire for a creation myth, really, and a desire to understand the early history of the world in that sense, which now we do via other geological and non-anthropomorphic sort of means. But the idea of, okay, what happened, when, like, in the early times, were there these huge giants, were there these titans, the idea of the titans, the idea of Atlantis, for example, as being a kind of early history, a proto-history of the world. So the question of what was there, at a time that we don't remember, but, and so again, the poetry plays a role out there, because you have these poems which have come from who knows where. You look at the beginnings; they're really hoary. It's like you don't have a memory of even the folk memory of where it began. Where did the Iliad and Odyssey begin? We are now trying to reconstruct them in folk myths of the time, but at a particular moment, for them it was like, oh, these are ancient stories that have come down from us, and the idea that the ancients knew better. And the ancients knew more. So the idea of like an early history coming in. So a search for the genesis of the world, a search for the early history of the world, a search for understanding the origin of life. We have life, but what is the origin of life? An understanding of the nature of the soul and the difference between life and death. So the idea of life and death, and as we already said, the idea of order and rank, and who is more important. And in fact, like, think about it, it's probably going to be, at that time, it was a syncretic religion of many people from like many different regions coming together with different deities, and if you think of like, if we believed early religion to be mostly animistic and coming from like nature worship. So, the personification of natural elements, if you think of that, which then become divine elements and take on these, whole lives and these narratives in these poems, and then from there to go to order and rank of this, So, if you think about it, in fact, one of the very interesting sort of parts of order and rank is that in a lot of these Indo-European religions, the head god, the chief god, the modern chief god, and that's what Hesiod in his Theogony tries to give origin to that chief god as well, is the god of sky and weather, like Jupiter, who would be Zeus Pater in Greek, Zeus father, Deus Piter or Deus Piter in Sanskrit, and it comes from the idea of din, right? The day, and light, in fact. And so the idea of the divine as well as something to do with light. And then again, it becomes a pretty naturalistic thing. So in fact, we could go back to them and try and find cosmological and naturalistic elements to all the gods. But in common practice, that was not the only thing that people thought about, right? So when you think of, any of the gods, the first thing that one thinks of is not that this is a personification of wind, or this is a personification of thunder, or whatever. You think of, okay, in this case, should I pray to this god or this god? Who would help me out better? Who is the correct god to pray to? And so it gets related to ritual, and that ritual is again related to stories and myths and poems that have been created about these gods. So the question of the natural out here is fairly complicated. In some ways, what we are going to do to these gods in the next lessons is that what we'll do is what Hegel would call Aufhebung, right? So the gods will be aufgehoben. We will sublate them. So sorry, I should translate it as well. In English, Aufhebung is translated in too many ways to count, but like one of them is sublation, which is again a Latin word brought into English, so a bit complicated. Superseded, you could think of it that way. The idea is that preserving some essence of the old, a new sort of a new order, a new structure is created, which then itself is to be, superseded by something else. So what is happening out here, if we think of it in Hegelian terms, is that we have the naturalistic myths, which are then sublated, from below brought to the next level. From the naturalistic elements, which are sublated into naturalistic myths or animistic gods, let's say, which are then sublated into sort of narrative poetry and myth making and narrativizing of the lives of the gods, which will then, if you will see, be very interestingly sublated into natural philosophy, which you would which then, going back, you would try to draw a connection all the way down to the original naturalizing sort of animistic sort of views of divinity. But in fact, it's a next level. And we'll see all through this course how, a kind of Hegelian reading of early Greek philosophy is in fact pretty brilliant, and Hegel himself did it. In fact, I could share those texts with you. He has a history of philosophy, a lot of lectures on that, so I could share that as well with you if you wish. So, so what's going on in the pre-philosophical cosmogonies is that what we have here is a mythopoetic rather than a rational way of understanding the world. Yeah, there is a mythical element, but it is still a significant prelude, if you want to call it that. It's still a significant prelude to the more philosophical attempts to explain the world. Yeah, so what's going on here is a kind of quasi-rationalistic attempt to understand the world, but it is expressed in the language of myth. And as we said, for example, with Hesiod's Theogony, it is concerned with the world's ancestry. So it is concerned with the birth of the world, the creation of the world, the earlier history of the world, and also a systematization of legend. A systematization of legend in which the world is derived from like the world of the plural deities, that is, the world understood as the many deities of the world, are derived, the attempt is to derive them from a common ancestor or a common pair of ancestors. As we'll see, there are two different ways of looking at it. So that's what goes on in the pre-philosophical cosmogonies. So in the next two lectures, I know this one was longer than usual, but in the next two parts of it, I will talk about Homer and Hesiod. Maybe I'll just make it one lecture, so we'll see how many we do. So we'll talk about Homer and Hesiod, and the early attempts. I mean, we have already talked about Homer and Hesiod quite a lot, but in this sense, we'll talk about the early attempts at cosmogony, or what we can get of cosmogony or pre-philosophical cosmogony conceptually from these texts, and we'll also look at a bit of the Orphic religion of the time. So that was one of the proliferating religions apart from the Homeric. because that would really give us some kind of a background for when we study, later philosophy and the idea of the soul and the Pythagoreans. So we'll look at more at cosmological and cosmogonical beliefs of the ancients. So thank you.